I did laugh when I saw that his name. Apologies to any Italian American listeners, but I did laugh when I found out his name was Luigi Mangione. I was like, this is doing nothing to help the community.
No. I thought they were going to get away.
I know, me too. I was like, come on. And I think it was only because somebody ratted him out. They were like, I saw him at McDonald's. It's like, fuck you.
Yeah. I mean, the presumed degree of like
class solidarity.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to find a way to phrase it. Right? Like,
is that something we want to be doing solidarity with? I don't know.
Yeah. I kind of wanted to like find a way of saying like so tacit support, but not like not my tacit support versus like explicit support, but like the presumed sense that the population in the US to a person had tacit but not full support for this. Didn't go quite as far as
no one's gonna bust him out.
One worker in McDonald's.
Exactly. That's all it takes. It takes.
Don't go to McDonald's.
Don't go to McDonald's. Also, I mean
you just go anyway. You know,
I mean, Luigi advice. Let's not be on tape.
But like, I feel like you just like Ted Kaczynski yourself for a bit, don't you? Just like,
Anyway. I guess that's what you got to do until your brother turns you in. If that's what I think, that's what happened to Ted Kaczynski. Apparently, Luigi Mangione's Goodreads page has a review of what is it, Industrial Society and its Future.
Really,
Ted Kaczynski's manifesto. People are like, "Whoa, dude!" Yeah. The only reason I bring it up,
his list of like Goodreads was so suspicious it was almost like a put-up job. You know, it's like assassinate your house. Like, executive.
You know what I will say is that there haven't been any that I've seen like conspiracy theories around this. Everyone's just like, he was a healthcare CEO. Everybody hates him. Like, what are you gonna do? Libertarians hate him. Fucking liberals hate him.
No secret subtext to it at all, except presumably in the minds of the NYPD who refused to say what any motive at all.
The only reason I bring it up, and this is going to be because we're banking these, this is going to be kind of old news by the time this comes out, so it'll be like a few weeks from now, so people will be like, Luigi who? Only reason I bring it up is because there's been so much like it's almost like this is kind of what passes for class politics in an age of just pure stochastic violence and stochastic like political action, lone wolf bullshit, and the lack of any kind of like collective action or avenues for collective action, that as soon as like a healthcare CEO gets blipped, everybody acts like it's like Tsar Alexander getting like blown up or something like that. You know what I mean? And it was it's funny because I found his Twitter page because for some reason it didn't get deleted, his profile. And I was looking at his like tweets, and it was basically just like, because I was kind of like, fuck, please don't be like a socialist. Please don't be left wing. Please. But like, also, please don't be right wing. I don't really know what I want this guy to be. And it was just totally of our era. It was just total, like, kind of like center right libertarian, like, healthcare CEOs are the corporations are ruining this country. They're ruining our country. They're ruining the world. And then also mixed with like a smattering of men like, and like blue hair, goddamn blue hair is diverse. There was one thing I saw, and this is when I just had to stop. I was like, this is bad for my mental health. And so he was like tweeting about Richard Dawkins, and I was like, oh dog, I don't go down this path. And he was like, Richard Dawkins assumed that a post-Christian world people would be more rational, but instead they're worshiping at the shrines of diversity and inclusion. And I was just like, dude, you suck. Like, what are you talking about? But it's just, I don't know, it's so of our age, just like no real conception of class politics as they actually exist, no real avenues for collective class action, no class for itself action, just people who are supposed to be leftists being like, wow, he's one of us because he murdered a healthcare CEO, which, like, my take on that, don't give a fuck if I'm being honest with you. Just like, okay, I guess they'll be replaced immediately. And also like, whatever, dude. I don't have a take, honestly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I feel similarly. yeah, from what little I've seen of it, it does just seem like it's as you say, like exposed to the fullest pinnacle of our culture as it stands at whatever we are, at the end of 2024, seemingly motivated by an ideology quite heavily steeped in like sort of like masculinity and the deed, and seemingly recently wronged by insurance companies, and this was the target he chose. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, the left doesn't do violence for the by and by. Like it's just like, I don't know whether you'd call this guy right wing from what we've seen of him, but like it's clearly
like,
steeped in that culture.
Yeah. And I mean, it also just speaks to like not just political disillusionment, I guess, or at least just confusion, but it also just speaks to like the fact that I don't want to say that everything is falling apart or whatever, but it shows the cracks in just about everything. It shows the cracks in this weak libertarian attitude. It shows the cracks just as much in like this state, which is supposed to be all encompassing Leviathan. You can't do anything without being filmed. It's like, dude murdered one of the most powerful people in the world in broad daylight in the middle of Manhattan, which is like there are cameras everywhere, and would have gotten away with it. It's like,
it's so weird. It's like it's doubly both like I both want to ask myself I feel this deep feeling of surrealness to it all. Obviously it was like filmed, right, and like we've all seen some portions of that CCTV camera footage, and it's just sort of wildly surreal that as you say, in broad daylight kind of thing. And then also just sort of ask yourself the question, why doesn't it happen more often? Like as soon as that happens, it sort of it kind of makes sense. Not to like justify his motives necessarily, but like, and on the level of sympathy and understanding, it seems like a lot of people understand or seem to understand or claim understanding of this person's motives to some degree, not necessarily knowing what they are.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the only people that are, attempting to be like, he had a wife and children, how dare you? They're like Twitterati that just get dunked on immediately. You know what I mean? So, yeah,
I mean, it's fair. That's a fair enough thing to say, but the people that are saying it are the people that you have least sympathy with, like the mayor of New York, and or
another healthcare
any spokesperson from the like. It's like I mean, that's the other weird thing. Is like the degree of pleading from the great and the good that people should feel sympathy. It feels like they're sort of their portraying of sympathy and wagging their finger at sort of like what seems to be the majority of people's sort of like gut reaction to this seems desperate somehow. But,
yeah, exactly. And I mean, you're saying, you're saying like the left doesn't do violence by and by. And, for the most part, you're absolutely right until, violence is like thrust upon the working class or, members of the proletariat, and blah, 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 blah. And then obviously, I'm not saying that like nonviolence is, when you let people hurt you or whatever it is the anarchists always say. But like,
I'm not saying they shouldn't, like,
well, no, what I'm saying though is more so just like to kind of defend that though, is just say like, if all it took was murdering all the healthcare CEOs, we would have had communism a long time ago. It's not like feudalism where you could just go kill the king and a couple of nobles and, have a peasant rebellion for 30 years. You know what I mean? It's like, that's not what capitalism is.
Well, I almost joked before when you made the allusion to like Alexander the First or whatever. It's just like, maybe propaganda of the deed is right. Like, look at all of the sort of motivation, all the sort of like consciousness that is sort of risen in all of the people on Twitter, like who knew? The Narodniks, like not the Narodniks, like the Russian anarchists that were right. They were just doing it like 100
before the invention of Twitter.
Dynamite throwing plus the internet equals like
exactly
revolution.
Listen, if anybody is getting class consciousness from this, it's healthcare CEOs, because they're going to be like, "Oh, I actually need a bodyguard now." What the fuck? Well,
Well, great.
what are you gonna do? Great,
The
Luigi
contradictions have
Mangione.
been heightened, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't think they're gonna let him out of
No.
prison
Oh,
anytime
well, yeah, no.
soon. Um,
Trump pardon, maybe?
Trump. Oh my God, that would be insane. I don't
No,
even.
no, no,
That
no,
makes
no.
me feel
No,
sick.
no, 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 no.
What
No,
we
no, no,
can
no.
say though, Dan, is that this is going to be a swing towards the party of order. There's my transition for us. The party of order is just about to take over again in the United States, taken away from Joe Biden's party of liberty, and that's what we're going to be left with, presumably. Bit of reaction. Dan, why don't you tell us what we read for this one? Because we read a few essays that we came across, I guess, like last week. Some people were talking about them in our Discord. So why don't you go ahead and say it?
Yeah, so there's a well, I hadn't heard of them, although seemingly they've been around for a few years. An online magazine in the UK called Prometheus, and they've seemingly put out a call for submissions for essays, articles, generally gathering people on the left's thoughts around the idea of forming a new left wing political party in the UK. They seem to have cast their net quite broadly, or rather, the 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 responses that they've had have quite a broad scope in terms of sections of the left that they're coming from and the attitudes that people are taking, which I'm broadly quite in favour of and sympathetic to. Maybe we'll get into it. The three, I think we just read three. There've been a few that have been published. There were three of them that had been published when we set about preparing for this episode. The three that we read sort of have quite divergent sort of places from which they come, but were quite stimulating. Of they're sort of like generally minded toward reviewing the position of the British left and trying to work out what to do next. What kind of political party? How should we think about that? What do we even mean by a political party? Questions around sort of left-wing regroupment. Who should be the focus of this effort? Where should we be looking for prospective members of a new party? What kind of like agency should we imagine it having? So it's quite a broad topic. It's quite nice to shift our focus back toward left-wing and Marxist political strategy. Yeah, I enjoyed
Yeah.
reading these.
It was good to come back to this stuff. I mean, like we've we've taken a. It's been a long time since we've like read something specifically about, as you say, like Marxist political strategizing, a la, like a mass party or something like that. Long time ago, one of the main kind of cornerstones for the show was reading Mike McNair's Revolutionary Strategy, which I think is probably the cornerstone for a lot of kind of modern Marxists thinking, whether you agree with it or disagree with it. And I think it was really interesting coming back to this stuff in somewhat of like an abbreviated way, but coming back to these discussions as they pertain to now, kind of after having in between reading Revolutionary Strategy and reading a bunch of like ultra left shit, whether that's in the vein of kind of like councilist stuff that was, initially really inspired by a lot of the debates going on around the time of the Second International and just kind of like generally social democratic politics, as that kind of morphed into more recognizably councilist strategies, moving on from Pannekoek stuff like the Group of International Communists, reading the Communizer stuff, which is, explicitly kind of against this method of strategizing, at least to a certain extent, or maybe just explicitly is. And then, our odd, what are we going to read this week? Let's read some anarchist stuff as well. But it's really interesting kind of coming back to this stuff with that kind of scope, I suppose, or with that kind of understanding of a lot of the critiques that we might not have had to level at this stuff before when we read it. But at the same time, I mean, as we always say, we are whatever the last thing we read claims to be. And, now I'm back on like full mass party shit. But in kind of an interesting way, it's kind of, I don't know, we'll get into it. But it's also worth saying, I suppose, that this is an ongoing kind of publication thing where they're accepting submissions. So, hey, people, if you want to write something for it, go ahead, submit it. I'm sure they'd love to see that. We'll put a link to Prometheus and all that stuff. But also, that is to say, this episode isn't coming out for another 2 weeks, so there probably will be a few more submissions that we haven't read. So we read the ones by Archie Woodrow, Mike McNair, and Lawrence Parker, I believe are their names. So if there are any other groundbreaking essays that we didn't get to, what are you going to do? Sorry.
I feel like this is one of those episodes where we've just got to pick a place to start, and actually, it's going to end up we're going to end up all over the shop very quickly, probably. I mean, I don't know whether we've said yet. One of these essays was written by Mike McNair, and it's in some ways like a restatement of some principles that we've seen before, come across before. One of the things maybe I'll say to kick us off a little bit is like, there are quite a, if this is a debate around whether to form a new left-wing party or whether to not form a party, form some kind of new left-wing organization. What should that organization look like? What should its structure look like? One of the things that I guess the essay of these that comes from in some ways like the clearest place, because it's so much in Mike McNair's wheelhouse, is his contribution, and like one of the things that maybe I'd like to say to begin with is, well, one of the ways to frame a possible way of framing this discussion is like, are we talking about like a strictly Marxist political party, or are we talking about, because there are some like Archie Woodrow introduces a few pieces of terminology which I feel like are quite useful for framing this. There's a discussion around forming like a party that's intentionally anti-capitalist, or an organization that's intentionally anti-capitalist. And then there's also correlated with that a discussion around forming some kind of new electoral coalition to contend elections in the UK. And I guess in a discussion like this, which is casting its net so broadly, what you're going to capture, and I think it's quite good is captured by it, is people on all different sections of the left, all the way through from self-described and very conscious, deliberately aligned Marxists and people with a political strategy very heavily informed with Marxism, all the way through to people recently influenced by the experience of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders in the US, perhaps, to sort of like broaden the scope a little bit. And for me anyway, I sort of feel like this discussion should have all of those people in mind, at least initially. Maybe we come from, you and I, perhaps, having done this podcast for 4 years, have found ourselves in a place where we might hold certain like very specific ideas about what the right course of action should be, or what the best way to potentially to overcome capitalism might be. But when it comes to like having discussions around building a new base for political action, there are a lot of people out there who don't have that politics, but trying to work out how to communicate to them, whether to be in an organization with them, whether to be in an organization adjacent to them. Anyway, these are some of the things that I'm, I suppose, coming into this with, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, right? Because, what you bring up is absolutely right, because that's kind of almost the first question you need to ask about who is it that we allow into our party and how do we control what the party does, right? Because, if you talk to any kind of progressively minded normie, they're going to you're going to explain your ideas to them, hopefully, and be able to explain it clearly, which is something I struggle with. And then they're probably going to go, yeah, I mean, that all sounds right. Why hasn't there been a political movement based off of this stuff? Why isn't there one right now? Why does it seem like it always fails? Why is it that whenever you meet any of these people, they're just a number of squabbling sects, and all they can do is just tell you about why the other sects are stupid and why their sect is really, really smart, right? To say nothing of just why there are so many sects to begin with. And that's kind of the question that all of these authors are kind of trying to grapple with, which is why do all of these sects exist? And why do we still want to defend this idea of something like a 19th and 20th century style mass party? The kind of, apotheosis of which seems to be the SPD in Germany, but obviously all of these authors will have their criticisms of that, and their own reasons for why all of that stuff failed. But all of these authors, seemingly pretty influenced by Mike McNair, and then just Mike McNair himself, come down on this idea of factionalism and sectarianism as being mainly caused by a few issues. And those are generally things like excessive centralization, relying on just, a small group of people or one leader in particular to tell you all of the right things. Everybody who has experience with any of these sects will be able to tell you that generally they're all kind of cults of personality. And this doesn't really limit itself to kind of like political groups, like there are economic groups, like, you could think about the economic groups centered around somebody like Andrew Kleiman or somebody like the guy who wrote the other value theory book, whose name I can't remember right now. These are generally kind of cults of personality, to say nothing of whether, how correct they are or whatever. But they also kind of blame a lot of this stuff, and this is kind of a big bugbear for, again, all three of these authors, on the ban on any kind of factions, any kind of dissent you need to crush, right? And this is something that is so seemingly unique and specific to the left, and specifically the Marxist left, is this idea that you need to operate in complete groupthink, 100% agreement on all of these different political strategy issues in order to act at all, right? And, this is where, when normal people kind of engage with these sects, they kind of get turned off immediately because it just seems like petty sectarian squabbling. Because it is. It's like, oh, I belong to an IMT group and we believe this. I belong to, I don't know, Socialist Appeal or Socialist. I don't actually know the lineage of a lot of these groups, and we believe this, right? And you kind of see a lot of that in these essays. But you just need to figure out where you draw the line, right? Because at a certain point, a lot of the stuff about you can't crush dissent, you can't ban factions is true. But what I think all of these authors do recognize, especially McNair, is that there is still a central line that you are going to have to hold. And what that line winds up being is a political decision, and how that political decision winds up being made can influence how much of a cult of personality it turns into, how many people you turn away. So it's really complicated. And I think just the last thing I'll say on that is that, like, the reason it seems like a lot of this doesn't happen in bourgeois parties or parties that aren't explicitly anti-capitalist is because they can always fall back on the resources of the state, and because generally, or capital in general, and I suppose just because generally it is accepted that you're not trying to massively change things, you're just trying to kind of, go about your plan for growth or your plan for political capitalism, I guess, to draw from a more recent reading. But yeah, these are all really tricky kind of concepts, and the authors give their kind of takes on how you get around this kind of sectarianism.
Yeah, it's a really good way of encapsulating the problem. There's like this. It's just in some respects, it's just a historical problem, right? Like, both there are these legacies coming from sort of the early history. Well, initially, I guess, in some ways, inherited legacies from how Lenin's Russian Social Democrats operated under what other sort of anti-democratic conditions they existed in Tsarist Russia, and then there's the legacy of the split between the communists and the Social Democrats, and the, as you say, and as we've covered before when we read Revolutionary Strategy, like this history of the whatever it is, 21 conditions for membership of the Communist International that were published in the early 20s that featured this sort of like general ban on sects and factions within organizations. And then I guess it's just a legacy of fragmentation, as you were saying before. Like, the further you get from, obviously, like, there is, I guess, a unifying effect that comes from being in power, and like left-wing parties and organizations have never been particularly close to that. I thought the sort of like I think that one of these essays, I can't remember who wrote it, was, you'll tell me in a minute perhaps, was a history of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And I thought one of the really interesting aspects of that was a distinction made between left-wing political organizations that came about almost purely as sects, I suppose, that resulted from splits where certain groups of people allied themselves with a particular charismatic figure, and like there was a split in an organization and a load of people went off following one person. When that is your history, when the history of like parties on the left is a series of splits where the size of organizations get fewer and fewer, and it's just more groups of people allied with particularly charismatic figures who what you end up with is like one of the distinctions that's often given is these groups are like what you have to do in being a membership of one of these organizations is you just commit yourselves to a particular doctrine, a particular set of thoughts, whether they're like Trotsky or Tony Cliff or whoever the person is that founded or is considered to be the big brain thinker of your organization. But it's interesting, there's also this legacy of like the Communist Party of Great Britain coming together as like a union of different left-wing political organizations. Now, I don't fully understand what the implications of that legacy are, but it does like create an interesting dichotomy of like different ways to form an organization, whether you are like I guess it's, I mean, you know, it's quite obvious, I suppose. It's either a splintering or it's a grouping together. And the question for our day is now we are splintered. What does regroupment look like, I guess?
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
maybe just to come back to what I was saying before, because I sort of lost my train of thought, but it's sort of come back to me a little bit, because like there is a parallel in some ways between the Archie Woodrow piece and the Mike McNair piece, where like it's seemingly from the standpoint of Woodrow, like there's a recognition of this distinction between there being in the UK and maybe other Western countries like a body of conscious anti-capitalists in anti-capitalist or in socialist organizations, and then there also being like, now I'm sort of putting some of my own opinions into this or my own analysis, I guess, but being a body of sort of like a potential constituency of self-conscious left-wingers, I suppose, with a sort of like broad affiliation to the left in some ways. Basically, Woodrow makes this distinction between anti-capitalist regroupment and electoral regroupment, and I think like the electoral regroupment being like slightly broader than the anti-capitalist one, right? So your question is like, do you form an anti-capitalist organization, and then under conditions of first past the post, if it is that you intend to compete in elections, what kind of grouping of left political parties do you associate yourself with? But then coming back to what I was saying before, like Mike McNair has this much more strict focus. His thing is almost like a purer Marxist regroupment, you know, like is the formation of a new left-wing political party actually, should it be a grouping together of self-conscious Marxists? It seems, from my understanding, the sort of like thrust of Mike McNair and other co-thinkers of his around the Weekly Worker and around the Communist Party of Great Britain Provisional Central Committee, their focus has often been let's bring back together the various sort of splintered parties of the left. I suppose similar to that tradition within the original Communist Party of Great Britain as being coming together, a union of left-wing organisations. But given what we know of the nature and culture of left-wing sects in the UK, I guess it's a seriously important and very outstanding question. Like, is that even a good way to start? Is that a good idea? You know, like, is there somewhere else to go? And like, well, that's not what Woodrow. Although Woodrow is like motivated and heavily influenced by McNair and ideas regroupment, they've got like they've got very similar criteria to what Mike McNair would put in place, I think, for who you should try and group together with.
Yeah. It's Marxist unity. As long as there are still enough Marxists to do that, it's Marxist unity. It's funny because, reading this stuff, it does come across, and I was really trying to question why this was, because by all accounts, this is, if you are interested in building a working class political movement, these ideas are about as sound as you're going to find, you know what I mean? But still, reading a lot of this stuff, it does come across as very outdated. And I'm not entirely certain I can really put into words why, other than the kind of criticism we've come across recently on the show, which is, one that's maybe we can talk a little bit more about later, which is about the actual nature of a working class movement when there's no possibility for capital to grow at levels that it has previously, kind of for the last 50 years, and what that means for kind of the positive gains that a movement like this would require. But it's funny because that question of regroupment and that question of bringing who you're bringing together and who you want to bring together, and I think in Lawrence Parker's essay, he wrote something like, there was a line, something about like the onward march of dissension or something like that, which I really, really liked, where it's like, hey, you're going to disagree with these people on things. That's fine. You're still Marxists. Grow up. You can have, your different groups where you try and, politic with people. That is what politics is. You're going to have to do politics to try and get more people to listen to your side, right? But it's also like, you're talking about this as a historical problem. And I think for me, I've always kind of seen it, at least in the last few years of doing the show, as a bit more of like a systems or an organizational problem, right? Because really what I think you're trying to do is figure out the best way to tie your party in, the broad term, whatever your movement is, tie the kind of instruments of that organization, the organization itself, to the interests of the working class as it pertains to building towards socialism. And that's a particularly tricky thing to do. Obviously, when we've read, Stafford Beer, his kind of main bugbear is how you avoid like bureaucratic ossification, where, this is what happened in the SPD. This is why the Freikorps got sent in to crush all of the Soviets with the SPD's approval, right? Because certain organizations at a certain point will be more interested in, the survivability and the survival of the organization as opposed to its stated goals, which might be building towards a classless society in whatever form they see that taking. So that might cause some bureaucrats, some full-time party members to make deals with bourgeois parties, to join bourgeois parties. I mean, obviously we've seen that time and time again. And really the question then is, how do you build an organization that is self-sufficient in its drive towards giving the working class a political voice, right? And, I don't really have an answer to that right now. I suppose the simple answer would just be you need to have something to cohere people, right? You need to be, maybe one of the other answers as to why we just have so many squabbling different sects is because there's no real actual movement to attach themselves to. I forget exactly what, it's like a letter or something that Marx wrote where he famously said something, along the lines of, sects are all well and good, but as soon as there's any kind of class, upswing in class consciousness, they all just immediately become reactionary because they're not actually tied to the movements of the class itself, right? And so you would need to actually find a way to build organizations that, I guess just to put it simply, just consistently keep themselves busy. It seems like you would want groups that really get themselves involved in whatever struggles there are. And I don't think that's something that McNair or Woodrow or any of these people would necessarily disagree with, right? I think specifically Woodrow talks a lot about, in the third kind of definition of a class that they give, like as being a kind of Leninist conception of the party, which is, one in which the various struggles in parliament, in workplaces, and in different communities are all recognized as different fronts of the same struggle. But it does seem like as soon as you have a group that calls itself a political party that is kind of detached from those struggles, it ceases to kind of be progressive in any kind of historical sense. And that isn't to say that a lot of these groups don't try to do that. Like you go to the Palestine marches in London or wherever, and these groups are always there. They're always showing their support. But I think there's a big difference between, showing up and like actually being involved. In that last essay, the Lawrence Parker one, they talk about like, in the heyday of the Communist Party of Great Britain, they kind of had the reverse problem where people were more than happy to trust them with their struggles. They're more than happy to vote for them as trade union stewards, as, people on the shop floor or whatever, but they wanted nothing to do with them when it came to politics, right? Which is kind of a different question. But I suppose that's the kind of thing that I think about, is like, how can you actually connect the interests of the party as a system to the interests of the class as a whole? And the only way to do that is to actually have it be actively engaged in these struggles. And then the question becomes, how do you do that without coming across as like cringe and just like showing up and being like, just do communism. There wouldn't be a war, a genocide in Palestine if you just had communism. You know what I mean? Like,
mm-hmm. I mean, one thing to say with that is like, it's always quite difficult to know. Well, I suppose we shouldn't. I'm thinking now about the classic behavior of the sect, which is very visible at sort of like protests and in campaigns, but whose motivations it's always hard to discern as to whether they're purely motivated toward growing the ranks of their organization and sort of like quite inward looking more than they are minded toward providing political representation of the working class, which is what like McNair, in his like Marxist conception of what a political party is, has its sort of its founding principle as like representing the class, like representing the working class and championing it as a sort of independent force, one which is which can exist in and for itself. It's like developing toward that degree of class consciousness which would allow the class to be acting entirely for itself. And with him, with that, the essay that of his in this collection, what it made me think quite a lot is like, what it made coherent for me is something which sometimes feels incoherent, which is that distinction between acting in a revolutionary manner or acting in a reformist manner, and that idea of trying to having the center of your tactic be creating a force that can like represent the interests of the working class independent of other classes, does sort of like allow for a degree of transition between doing pursuing seemingly reformist ends in politics, but having them be leading toward sort of an ultimately revolutionary outcome, if what they're intended to do is like strengthen the class in itself, kind of thing.
Yeah, I thought that was maybe one of my favorite bits of all of these essays, was where McNair is actually talking about what it actually means to have a working class party. And it's almost a bit counterintuitive at a certain point, where what McNair is saying is that, on one hand, in capitalism, you have the party of order and you have the party of liberty, which are always, they spontaneously show up in capitalism. And, because you can't just have political parties that are just like, oh, we're the party for US steel manufacturers who are interested in tariffs on goods, right? It's like, you need to actually, first of all, you need to cohere the capitalist classes in varying factions as a group, whatever that might be, and then you need to get mass support for them so that people will actually vote for you. You spontaneously generally get two broad categories of political parties in capitalism. One being the party of order, which attempts to fix all of the problems of capitalism by being, oh, girl, we're strong, we're tough people. If only we could go back to when things were good and strong and tough before all these, progressives got in power. And then you have the party of liberty that's like, you need to shed those vestiges of pre-capitalism. You need to shed those vestiges of, we need to be progressive. We need, this is exactly what we're talking about with the Robert Brenner, Dylan Riley piece about Joe Biden, where he's like, trying to harken back to this progressivism that may or may not be entirely possible anymore. And what McNair is saying is the working class party needs to actually give workers an independent voice, independent of those two factions, right? And it's really interesting because, you hear a lot of kind of more left critiques of McNair, calling him like a volunteerist or something like this, where it's, it's kind of just like knee-jerk reactions to Leninism, because Leninism basically just in Russia at least just wound up being more or less a form of flunkyism, people kind of just get scared that, okay, they just want a vanguard, which is just the people that are going to tell us what to do, and it's going to be bureaucratic centralism, blah, 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 blah. But it's definitely not what McNair is doing. And it's really interesting because it almost speaks to a trust in the proletariat that you generally would only find in more kind of like ultra left stuff, where it's like he's basically saying, look, we just need to be building the organizations for an independent working class voice. And you don't even necessarily need to be explicitly anti-capitalist. You know, you would want to be, but you wouldn't. What I mean by that is you wouldn't necessarily want to be explicitly like, we are building communism right here, right now. It's that or nothing. He's basically just saying, engage with working class people where they're at. And the implication of that, he doesn't come out and say this, but the implication of that seems to be that that in itself would be working towards communism, which is really, really interesting. And yeah, it just surprised me reading that from him. I was like, oh, cool, man.
I really hadn't thought about it in that way before. You've really clarified it for me, which I appreciate, which is sort of coming back to that thing that I was kind of alluding to my struggling with beforehand, right? Where like in a discussion around forming a political party, a new political party in the UK, like there's the question of like, what do Marxists do, and then there's a question of like, how do Marxists relate to a currently sort of scattered and disillusioned sort of remnants of like the Corbyn movement, which I don't really know how to define. There's like as I was reading these essays, I was trying to create some just of good terminology to describe our present moment, I suppose, and like social democrat didn't really scan very well, because although maybe these people on the left sort of have had affiliations to Corbynism, maybe they weren't thinking about it in those strict terms, you know, like, are they anti-capitalist, are they not, like is that distinction in the heads of how many of these like post-Corbyn leftists in the UK, is the sort of anti-capitalist versus capitalist distinction a relevant one? Like, are they reformists or revolutionaries? Is that a relevant one? But to say that the majority of these people are members of the working class, politically activated by circumstances in their lives and looking for ways to engage politically in the world, like, that's quite a sort of like what you've sort of like presented there as Mike McNair's approach is like quite a sympathetic one, which is like here are people with capacities, we know they have political instincts, let's work out how to facilitate them. There are some aspects of like his version of the Leninist approach which feel a little bit like paternalistic, you know. There's a degree to which he's saying if the class isn't ready, then you sort of create the organization to, I don't know, to shepherd them or whatever. But
well,
that's not being
that.
Not me being anti-paternal. I don't know.
maybe
maybe it is just paternalism. Yeah. Let's not.
I mean,
not,
the thing is,
I don't use that. Well, one could choose to use that pejoratively. I guess I'm choosing not to in this instance, at this moment in time, I guess. You know?
I think, I mean, the thing is we can't just be full. This person doesn't actually exist, but like full ultra lefties don't do anything, man. You know what I mean? Again, that person doesn't exist. Even communizers, even anarchists, well, definitely not anarchists, but you know, the person doesn't actually exist where it's like, we just do nothing. There's always, we're Marxists, we're socialists, we're communists, we're anti-capitalist. Like there's always going to be an element of needing to push the class further, because otherwise we just sit on our hands and do nothing. We'd have communism in a year. You know what I mean? Like the kind of point is that it's like, you know, whether or not the class is inevitably heading towards a classless society, towards revolution, is beside the point, because even if we didn't have the ecological question, even if we didn't have questions of short life expectancies and, you know, 2/3 of everybody going to bed hungry every night, moral questions and practical questions, whatever, like, you know, you'd still want to try to make this happen as soon as possible, whether or not the conditions are there for it, whatever that actually means to you, right? Like there's always going to be an element of, I forget what it was in that endnotes piece they called it, but it's like something volunteerism. It's always, you're going to need to spread the word, and you're always going to need to try and push these practical struggles further. And so, you know, I suppose there's always going to be an element of non-judgmental, me using this again, paternalism, because it's like otherwise you wouldn't necessarily really need to have a working class party at all. And this is the big question though, right? And this is why people do get like uncomfortable with kind of Leninist, McNairist, whatever, like political strategies, is because in that case somebody's going to need to decide where the lines are and what it is that they're working towards and how best to go about doing that. The way that McNair and a lot of some of the other authors in this like get around that is by basically saying you need to structure your political party in such a way where you have radical democracy and all of these different factions and you have this onward march of dissension, and they kind of just fall back on that as a way to be like, and so that's how we get around a kind of like totalitarian big beard telling you exactly what to do, which I think might be a little bit of a cop out, because I do think that some of the cults of personality stuff is maybe like actually inherent to this method of political organizing. But you know, at least there are efforts to ameliorate that. But again, there does need to be an acceptance that whatever your political organization, you're going to need to set goals and boundaries, and somebody is going to need to decide what those are somehow. And maybe just saying, but we'll ban factions isn't really enough. But I don't know, maybe if you're just involved in struggles, that strategy will kind of get sorted out for you. But I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely a good starting point is to say, like, or to presume that being involved in intentional political work, being involved in struggle, allows you to sort of take one step away from being a sort of like cult of personality sect, I suppose. So maybe it is that. Maybe it's like there's no definite way of doing it. There's just sort of like some sort of hallmarks that point in the right direction. It was quite nice to re-encounter questions around democratic centralism as a form of party organization. It almost felt reading McNair. I mean, we've touched on this in the past. I'll confess that I've sort of like forgotten some of the ins and outs of like what we've read about democratic centralism in the past, but like it was quite nice. It was almost like the way McNair was presenting it, that it almost is minded toward what you were saying before around the sort of like question of organization and how you structure your organization to keep the organization intentionally minded toward a particular set of goals. In our case, like being intentionally anti-capitalist in a way which intends to empower the working class. But it was like the way McNair was presenting democratic centralism. It's quite nice. Like it almost felt like that was a piece of terminology being set in a historical context, or because sometimes you hear the phrase democratic centralism banded around almost just like a sort of shibboleth of the Marxist sect, such that it seems to appear as a justification for a particular type of very strictly centralized organization where dissension isn't allowed and everybody has to be like committed to the same sort of like set of doctrinal ideas. But the way McNair is pitching that as a sort of this as a sort of very necessary skirting of two poles, one the sort of radically decentralized federalist system, and the other the kind of like monarchical anointing of one particular person as the leader of your organization. It's quite nice to have a callback to sort of the Lassallean political structure of workers' parties in Germany in the 19th century as being this form of sort of like almost monarchical-esque structure where one person is the great leader. And to have democratic centralism presented as this effort to skirt these two different poles makes it like seem like an alive political debate and not just like a sort of like turgid piece of terminology that's banded around. So
Yeah, it's not bureaucratic centralism; it's
yes, of course,
democratic centralism.
yes.
Yeah,
No, no,
McNair in
someone.
this. McNair in this talks. I think it was McNair, where he talks about criticisms of federalism. What did you make of all that stuff? Where he
I
basically
mean,
is
it's funny
saying that.
because we read these criticisms of federalism um in revolutionary strategy, and I
Mm,
remember like not really, I was
yeah.
struggling to make heads or tails of it again. Like I mean, the analogy seems to be that like federalism is a political structure um, sort of steeped in bourgeois ideology, designed somehow to protect property rights of the bourgeoisie.
Mm,
Like I don't know, like for McNair anyway, it sounds like federalism is much more a constitutional piece of terminology, very heavily connected to sort of types of political economy and um, the bourgeois state, and not a more flexible, broad piece of terminology for organizational structure in general.
mm.
But like but then it seems really his problem is that like if you have too decentralized an organization, it just becomes impossible for it to act uh, coherently. I guess
Yeah,
is
well,
that
and I
like
suppose the one thing you need in an anti-capitalist organization is coherence around the goal of anti-capitalism. I know I just said that McNair is basically saying, you don't need to be explicitly we're building towards communism, but you do, right? And I think he recognizes that. Like you do actually need to have as your end goal, stated goal. We don't want any fucking capitalists in our party. We don't want any, unless they're gonna like switch over and be cheeky. We don't want any fucking bourgeoisie ass landlords in here. We need to actually keep the stated goal of um building towards a classless society and being explicitly anti-capitalist. And I suppose that's where the centralism comes in.
but
There's one
also
bit in
like
here. Oh, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say for him like the distinction between the minimum maximum program is uh like if you codifying those two sets of goals as two different things, one which is like the maximum program of what communism will look like, and the minimum program being what communists will do day one when they form a government, kind of thing. um you can then sort of like, I suppose, keep one eye on the here and now and one eye on the communist horizon and be able to be explicit about both, but also explicit about what those two sort of sets of um, goals will require at any given time. I suppose maybe that's the idea.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely that makes sense. And yeah, and but also I suppose part of the minimum program would just generally be something that Archie Woodrow, I think, wrote about, which is trying to get past this idea of state loyalty, right, and state loyalism, which is also like a McNair kind of bugbear kind of thing, about being not loyal to the state of which you are part, which is an incredibly difficult line to toe from like an organizational perspective, because it's like, oh, well, you are now part of that state. How do you put your interests aside? You know what I mean? And all of a sudden act with, against the state that you're a part of. It would seem like on an individual scale that would actually threaten some people's power. But what are you going to do? At one point in this, McNair is like, we need to act like they did in the 1600s, and when there was a full-scale Dutch invasion invited the British Isles. And I was like, oh yes, communism is when we were invaded by the Dutch. I see what you're saying, McNair. I see what you're saying. Restore the House of Orange. Is the House of Orange? Whatever. I'm not going to show off how little I know about English history. I think one thing before we wrap up, we should definitely talk about this long quote that we've come across before, but it's a quote of Marx's that McNair gives at length in his piece, which is, it's the one that begins, nota bene, as a political movement, the political movement of the working class has as its object, of course, blah, 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 blah. It gets cited in a million different things for a million different reasons with a million different interpretations. And the one reason I wanted to bring it up is because at the beginning of this quote, Marx seems to be saying something different than what he's actually saying at the end of the quote. And this is kind of classic Marx's writing, where it's, he says one thing and he goes, it would seem this way. Oh, but yes, but actually it's this way. And I think that I'm glad that McNair gave this the full quote, because it's very easy to just pick out little bits and be like, this is how I think we should build a political movement. Because at the beginning, Marx seems to be making something like a teleological linear argument for how the working class political movement will actually unfold, because he talks about the relationship between economic struggles of the working class and seemingly like their emergence into a political struggle, where he talks about, um, certain workers on a shop floor fighting with their boss over specific working conditions. That's an economic thing. But then as soon as the working class gets together to actually fight for a shorter working day, that's a political movement. And Marx seems to be saying something like what we were just talking about with McNair, where it's like, eventually all of these economic movements will form themselves naturally as the working class gets its natural class consciousness, which will happen naturally, and all will naturally get to communism. But then Marx says something which I'll just quote, where he says, "But where the working class is not yet far enough advanced in its organization to undertake a decisive campaign against the collective power, i.e. the political power of the ruling classes, it must at any rate be trained for this by continual agitation against a hostile attitude towards the policy of the ruling classes. Otherwise, it will remain a plaything in their hands, as the September Revolution in France has showed, blah, 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 blah." And McNair just basically says, yeah, that's been shown to be the case, right? And maybe this comes a little bit back into the seeming like paternalism of a lot of this stuff.
It's not McNair's paternalism.
It's Marx's. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It goes all the way back, man. It goes all the way back. But, it's a interesting idea. It's almost one in which it's saying that the ideology of the working class is like political movement will be stuck in the class in itself attitude until it gets kind of trained in continual agitation by some kind of series of organizations or something to become a class for itself, where it recognizes that it is a class in itself and all these different things. But just to say really quick, I think that this kind of shows itself in what Marx's actual political life was actually like when he became involved with the First International, right? The International Working Men's Association, where that was very clearly not an organization that was designed to just preach to working people and be like, this is what you need to do. Why aren't you doing communism, you idiots? Join our sect. It was very clearly supposed to be an organ kind of for the training of the maturation of these different economic and political struggles of the working class, and one that kind of helped give them organs to reach across kind of international borders and to kind of further their own struggles, while at the same time being full of a bunch of people that will talk your ear off about how capitalism is the problem, right?
I mean, it's nice that there's like the word Marx uses, or this translator uses to say what Marx is saying, is like agitational work, right? It's nothing. It's not about being led so much as being like, I don't know. I guess the way I would interpret it in a McNairist fashion would be to say that, like, as we were saying before, you have to be like clear about your stated aims, but also like, just have to be consistent in your message, I guess. Like, I mean, I guess there's a way of looking at it where what's actually happening is, well, I guess it's that skirting of that line, isn't it, between like we will, by our work, we will make the working class revolutionary, or there's the sort of like the sort of left composition where the class will become revolutionary on its own, and like that's when the interaction will happen, kind of thing. And really what's contained in that Marx quote in his description of agitational work is some line between the two, right, where like the sort of like the consciousness develops, but it needs to be sort of like poked occasionally with a stick as well, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think fair enough, right? Like, yeah, those are large risks to take if you're a working class person organizing yourself politically, and you're going to need support, right? So, yeah. And again, this goes back to something we said before, where it's like, I would imagine a lot of the people involved in some of these movements would not technically match the criteria of being a proletariat, but for the most part, all these people are workers. You know what I mean? It's like, you are also a worker trying to do this stuff. Don't pretend like you sit outside. That actually is more of a path to paternalism than a lot of stuff, right? Where it's like just recognizing who you are in these struggles. It's okay. It's okay to push them in the right direction. Yeah, I guess I had two maybe separate things to say, just as we kind of like maybe get to the end. Is I was thinking a lot about how this kind of meshes with an idea that we came across in the Phil Neal book Hinterland, which again, communizer/communizer adjacent, seemingly kind of far strategically from what we've discussed here. But in there, he discusses kind of why it is that he thinks that so many of those like dipshit right wing groups, patriot movement stuff, were so successful in kind of, the American hinterland, right? And he talks about how it wasn't necessarily a thing where they were organizing like-minded people. They just went to a bunch of racists, working class people, and were like, hey, we're racist too. Join our blood and soil nationalist party, right? What they actually did was they kind of more or less, to the extent that this might be true, they went in supposedly to like disaster zones or zones that were, being stepped on by the Bureau of Land Management or something like that. And they actually gave people structures or just kind of helped them out themselves and showed them to be a dominant force in a region that could actually organize things positively. To the extent that they're still doing that, I'm not actually sure. And the conditions for this seem to be very specific. But it's an interesting idea, right? Where it's like hegemony in those cases didn't actually come from, Marxist unity or from a purity of some kind of sectarian belief and, you know, the true nature of the class's path to communism or whatever. It actually came from positively showing yourself to be a force that can be reckoned with. And then it grows exponentially because then you get more people to be involved, blah, 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 blah. Now, I think there's a lot to be said about how that is really difficult to do in a left-wing context because we wouldn't want to do a lot of the things that those groups were doing, one of which was just outright like intimidating populations and being like, we're the only people that can help you, so we're going to help you. That's obviously not what we'd want to do. But it is also there's some interesting ideas there about how that could be merged with something like a party movement, because again, growth doesn't necessarily come from, you know, being ideologically pure or whatever. It comes from being able to show yourself to be a group that people would want to associate themselves with. And that's interesting because one of the communizer critiques of a lot of this stuff, or just a critique that Robert Brenner, I suppose, kind of comes up with, is just this idea that those positive gains in a Marxist sense, in a working class politics sense, are maybe actually not particularly possible anymore. Those gains that would, in a social democratic sense, that would fuel a working class political movement, as has been the case in the past, right? A lot of the things that Parker and Woodrow and McNair are talking about here might not be economically or politically possible to do in a modern political context, to the extent that it would make people attracted to your party, right? Like social democratic reforms, things like that. But I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It's always been an idea that stuck with me because I don't really know how to necessarily say how useful it is in a left-wing context. But I do think that there's truth to the fact, and this has been shown by, I think, successful social democratic movements, that like people will associate themselves with you and your movement because it can actually do something, right? And so maybe it's just about the left trying to figure out what it can actually do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are certainly elements of the strategy as described in that book that I like, in the Hinterland book, which I think are relevant, right? I think, but maybe it comes from a different position, like the whether we live, a la Robert Brenner, whether we live in conditions of a economic system that's driven by financialization and doesn't leave open sort of like economic surpluses that can support traditional social democratic programs, and don't bring working class people together in factories in a way that allows for forming of mass working class organizations in the way that they did in the 20th century. There is always the scope for working out what people's needs are and potentially trying to solve their problems for them. Not for them, but like help them solve their problems themselves. Let's get away from that again. The paternalism again. I mean, I guess in the broadest sense, it's just the sort of like strategy of the Black Panthers, right? Like, what can you provide as an organization that meets people's most basic needs? and maybe you just start with that. There are like, I guess there are some things that are a bit uncomfortable about that, because that strategy of just proving yourself to be the people with the ability to solve a problem means that people are potentially aligning with you, not because they're all like deeply conscious and convinced Marxists with a strong conviction, but like that's never actually going to happen, right? Like, um, it's always going to be the case that like people are going to have varying degrees of political consciousness and commitment, um, just predicated on the sort of like general interests. Like, is it going to be something that people are going to think about deeply all the time? Most people probably not. Um, are people? I mean, it comes back to the sort of age-old political question for me. Like, are people's political motivations? What are they? Are they deep, or are they quite shallow and like spur of the moment? Like, to some degree, you can't like expect the platonic to be working toward building the platonic ideal of the working class party and its voter base, I guess. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. And it's also just like, how would you stop an organization like that from just purely becoming a large mutual aid group? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um,
That's one of the things that was quite interesting for me in the McNair piece, is like he seems to be drawing quite strict boundaries around what a political party is and what a political party isn't. And he's like, this shouldn't be substituting for a whole series of other social organizations, whether it's trade unions or I don't know, whatever else, like social organizations or that kind of thing. Like, there is a danger of people. Maybe one of the problems with the sect is like people get far too much of their social life from them, or their entire life becomes about them, or all of their meaningful organizations and the meaning in their lives comes from them. And to some degree, like, people need a much broader set of both political and non-political organizations to um, be a member of, and a political party should fulfill only a very small portion of people's social and political and sort of like perhaps even economic like relationship to the world, I guess.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah. I mean, that's like the two conflicting things in me, where it's like, I want a political party to be like that, but also you're right. Maybe it shouldn't just be this overarching totalitarian thing. It's like, I want to go to the communist hiking club, chess club. You know what I mean? I wouldn't go to the communist chess club. I'll leave that to you. I could not get my ass kicked. But, it's like,
It doesn't
yeah.
mean, yeah. I mean, that doesn't mean. I think you have all of those things. It's just like it's the working
Mm.
class chess club and not the Communist Party chess club,
Yeah, yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing. Like,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. The Communist Party
it's
Provisional
it's
Central Committee
another
chess club.
section. Yeah, I guess another section of the class acting and organizing itself for itself.
Mm. What's
Speculating wildly now.
well, yeah, just kind of just what we
Yeah.
do. I will say the one thing we didn't really talk too much about Lawrence Parker's essay. It was very good though. I really appreciated, man, Communist Party Great Britain, man. Like when they started going into the stuff about how it's like, man, you just find shop stewards who were like party affiliated up and down the country through the 70s. I was like, God damn, that's so cool, dude. That's like, I mean, in hindsight, I have no idea what it was actually like, but that's wild. I mean, even
He
like even some trade union bosses now, it's like, oh yeah, yeah, they were in the Communist Party. It's like, whoa, crazy.
Mhm. I can't remember what his exact piece of terminology is when he's describing it, but it's like he's sort of saying it's definitely not a sect, but it's not really big enough to be like a full blown political party kind of thing. And I think for him, the way it escapes being a sect is by virtue of that fact, right? It's like they actually have meaningful contact with working class organizations up and down the country and are engaged in struggle, I guess, coming back to that thing, rather than just like
Mm,
engaged in sect work and like
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I did love that, how it's like people were like, the Communist Party, they're just foreign
Russian
agents,
stooges,
foreign
yeah.
tools. And then it's like, who's your trade union boss? I would die for them. They're members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. That was awesome.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to read like scathing critiques of basically everybody on the left.
Yes,
It's definitely in that piece. You know?
that was very, very good. Yeah, yeah. And
But
in
that
the
his, but that it's funny that it's funny that essay is committed so heavily to a historical analysis of and a description of the Communist Party of Great Britain and its sort of splintering and those groups that exist today that claim different portions of that legacy. But the takeaway from it is actually like, don't do any of these things, and definitely don't like commit yourself to a sect. Almost the takeaway of that essay seems to be like, organize in any way that isn't this kind of thing, and the best outcome would be the total fragmentation of all of presently existing Marxist organizations. Um, their takeaway seems to be almost before you can have meaningful regroupment and positive construction of left wing and or communist Marxist organizations, you seemingly need to destroy everything that exists.
destroy it
That was my
all.
understanding anyway. I don't know whether your takeaway was that. Maybe I'm
No, I
reading
think
too
you're
much
right.
into it.
It was interesting, and then it was interesting to kind of compare that to I think it was the Archie Woodrow one where they were like talking about RS-21 as a political organization, which this essay made it seem pretty attractive, and yeah, it's just fascinating. It's just like yeah,
Mhm.
the
I mean,
activity of these groups like that are claiming to be provisional groups that will provisionally begin a political movement one day. It is just really interesting to see the ways in which they operate and about how it can be so like tough and tricky to hold these organizations together um, when there's like no real politics going on. It's pretty funny in your grim way.
yeah. This is. Well, I think this sort of debate that they're trying to stoke, these essays are a contribution to, and what it's like made me think about a lot is that very basic question of like, I mean, we through this have sort of just talked about uh, Marxist political strategy and what the sort of like what a Marxist party might look like, but the question here in some ways is how to bring that about, um, whether that's like a union of all of the Marxist parties into one, all of the presently existing ones. I feel like there's a danger of people getting bogged down in this idea of like the Communist Party being the advanced sections of the working class and seemingly mistaking the advanced sections of the working class for being those people that are already self-conscious Marxists in Marxist organizations. And it swings all the way from that to one, destroy all the sects and start again, but also um, maybe we should just start with all of those people that are like not particularly firm in their politics, but people who have gone through Corbynism and are now disillusioned on the left, at sort of like sort of exist in their communities, were motivated to be members of the Labour Party because seemingly there was a route towards like solving real social issues that they face in their lives and their friends and family face. Um, there's a big base of potential activists there, members of the working class, but their politics aren't like formed along Marxist lines. Is that the place to start, or is there somewhere in between? Like, really, it seems to be like the groups that Archie Woodrow identifies as being those ones which are committed to a sort of meaningful Marxist regroupment along like broadly, I won't say non-sectarian lines, but rather like would be committed to a sort of like the constitution of a party that would allow for the continued existence of factions and a lively democratic debate and discussion. And maybe it's a matter of bringing some of those groups together, but also being open to that sort of unaligned left as it exists.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people did get radicalized, like even along explicitly Marxist lines from that, the collapse of kind of the Corbyn movement. Like, loads of people, and it's funny because maybe a lot of their radicalization came from being like, okay, maybe I should be an explicit anti-capitalist. Let me dip my toe into like the world of anti-caste politics and being like, oh my god, what the fuck? Like trying to join some of these organizations. But I don't know, that stuff did thoroughly radicalize people, and obviously, as you say, is there potential there for just activism? Is there potential there for something else? Yeah, I don't
Tell you what,
know.
this made me think about quite a lot, actually. I went back and skim read the anatomy of the microsect again.
Oh yeah,
And
Draper,
like,
right?
yeah, Hal Draper, and that
Yeah.
sort of like I don't think I fully, when we read that piece, God knows how long ago, I don't know whether I came away with a very fully worked out understanding of what he's advocating around his idea of the Marxist center. Uh, this, to be brief, in my understanding, the sort of strategy he's elaborating is like every person should construct around themselves a group of like-minded thinkers if they can find them, or speak to people in their everyday lives, in their workplaces, down the pub, in whatever family unit or communal setting they live in, and like just be an advocate for those ideas and build a group of sort of co-thinkers. And in a lot of these pieces, there does seem to be that the bubbling up of that kind of tendency, that kind of thinking, of like everybody starting this work of recohering sort of like conscious grouping of sort of left-wing co-thinkers, I guess.
Mm, yeah. He definitely wasn't advocating doing the Maoist thing, which is go and work on a farm and in California and get your ass kicked
Yeah.
immediately because
Yeah.
it's way harder than you think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That of all of the kind of like mass party stuff, Lenin has kind of influenced politics. The Draper stuff has always been really, really, I think, excellent analysis. The stuff of his that we've read, um, especially that piece, because basically it's just like, what can you do? Here's something you can do. And it gets into this idea that's talked about not so much in here. It's mainly just implied about these ideas of like hegemony. I know that we talked about this when we interviewed Cliff from Cosmonaut, where it's just like somebody's going to have hegemony. If you want your ideas to, if you really believe that they're correct, you actually need to politic and fight for them, because otherwise somebody else's ideas are just going to have it, right? And so this idea of Draper's about like, forming around yourself a Marxist center, that's the first step towards it, I guess. It's interesting. Yeah. We also, Dan and I, for the listener, we also claim lineage from the Communist Party of Great Britain. We are the true bearers of that torch.
Yes, today we're going to set out to form the party.
Yeah, exactly. The party. Yeah. I can't claim any lineage. I wasn't even alive when it broke up, so unfortunately, what are you gonna do?
No.
All right. Well, it's so good to get back into talking about this stuff. We've been on an ultra left binge for like the last 20 episodes. So getting back to this stuff is really fascinating. Basically, I would just say, to kind of summarize where my thinking is, kind of where it is at this exact moment, is it's like, this seems, what we talked about today seems like it would be the absolute ideal for a Marxist working class politics to form. It just seems like the question is, are the conditions still around for a movement like this to really take off? All signs seem to be pointing towards no, but I don't necessarily take the like hardcore line on that, where it's like, well, don't even try, because it's like, why wouldn't you? Why would you just cede this area of class struggle? You know what I mean? So what are you gonna do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess my feeling is like creating an organization which is minded toward creating an independent political line for the working class, an independent representation of the working class, is actually quite a broad definition for what an organization should be and what conditions it that seemingly can be brought about under any conditions under which there is a sort of propertyless working class, under any conditions of capitalism. That sort of like motivation for an organizational structure seems valid, I suppose. So
I would hope. I certainly hope. Because I mean, it's fun because it's, then you just got to get into the ideas of like, well, what are the actual struggles that gear working people towards more of a Marxist conception of things, right? And in which eras of capitalism do those tend to come about? But I do tend to kind of think actually pretty similar to you, where it's like, it's still capitalism. People are still wage laborers. You know what I mean? This isn't neo-feudalism or whatever. It's like people are still working for a wage, that the contradictions all exist still. So seemingly you should be able to do something with that organization. Like, and again, as you say, like it is quite a broad definition of struggle. So, you know, maybe knee-jerk reactions against it. How useful are they? I don't know. We'll see. Don't just do what we do, which is just complain about everything on a podcast. We actually do something else.
Yes. Yeah. What I've realized, this is not a Marxist center, unfortunately.
Yeah. Whatever the opposite of a center is.
Yeah.
Marxist stochastic center.
Yeah, some kind of spiral.
Marxist spiral. I look forward to the sect, the like nihilist communist sect that takes that name. Well, all right. Well, everybody go check out the Prometheus stuff. Go check out Prometheus magazine. A lot of really good stuff in there. And they recently, I believe, merged with another magazine or publication group. So there's a lot of kind of life going on there, and good on them for platforming this debate and not just having like a strict, this is what the party is line. Because if nothing else, made for a good podcast episode, which is what I care about.
That's all we care about. Yeah. Great. Now we've got to work out what we're going to do next week.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever that is, we'll see.
I don't even know when it is.
Probably going to be taking. Probably going to be.
Is it the new year yet? Are we still are we in the space in between?
I think it's just before, or just after Christmas. It is. It is the 27th today. This is when we decide to put it out. So there might not be an episode in 2 weeks. Might be 4 weeks. I don't know. Jack's going back in the belly of the beast. Dan's got a bunch of shit to do, so we're going to take a little bit of time off. But we don't know what that looks like yet, so we'll see.
We will be back.
We'll be back. Exactly. That's what we want to say. All right. Thank you very much, Dan. This is very fun.
Thanks, guys.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.